The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, is a book one of you recommended to me here on YouTube a couple of months ago. So I do read your recommendations, it just takes me a long time to get to them. My time is fairly limited with a full-time job and trying to make YouTube videos and trying my hand at game dev, but I'm really trying to read your recommendations if I think the book is going to be good or interesting. And I'm glad I read this one, and in this video I'll tell you why. But first, a couple of words about the author. The book was written by Mark Lewis, who certainly has some credentials. He's a psychologist and a neuroscientist, and his work focuses on addiction and physiological changes substance dependence can cause. He draws from both academic research and his own experiences as he was addicted to drugs once. He managed to overcome his addiction and build quite a career for himself. He studies addiction and teaches, and he's co-written about 70 papers, and he also writes books such as this one, or Memoirs of an Addicted Brain, a neuroscientist examines his former life on drugs, and he also worked on bedtiming and emotional development with his wife, but in this video I'll just focus on the biology of desire. The book argues that addiction is not a disease but a learned behavior, and it tries to present supporting evidence in 9 chapters. The main idea is presented in the introduction, where the author also introduces himself. The first 2 chapters deal with theory, a bit of a background, a bit about the biological mechanisms behind addiction and drug use. Chapter 1 dives into different approaches you can have to addiction and describes some of the models we currently use to classify drug addiction and their strong and weak points. Chapter 2 talks about the brain and its role in addiction. Next, we have 5 chapters of what I'd call the meat of the book. My main takeaway from the book is that it's mostly case studies as viewed from the lens of addiction as learned behavior. Each of the chapters follow a different person with a different set of problems, different patterns of addiction, and a different story. But they all have something in common, even the person who doesn't even use drugs. And we'll talk about it in more detail later. The final 2 chapters are once again philosophical and theoretical, and once again try to support the idea that addiction is not a disease but a learned behavior. From theoretical background chapters, I enjoyed both chapter 1 and chapter 2, even though chapter 2 felt a bit disconnected from the rest of the book. Chapter 1 deals with different models of addiction, although if I remember correctly, it doesn't really go through all of them, and it doesn't even mention the one that is pretty prevalent in my addictologist bubble. This chapter actually brought me to the idea that maybe I should make a video about different addiction models and talk about them in more detail. It's something I'd find really interesting, and I hope it's something you'd find really interesting as well. Let me know in the comments if you would. Chapter 2 was good, although I did feel like it expects the reader to have some level of biological knowledge. To be fair, if you don't enjoy it or if you can't really understand what the author is talking about, I think you can skip chapter 2. It felt disconnected from the book, and I don't think reading through it really benefited the rest of the book. Even if you can remember the information that is explained there, it is rarely used in the rest of the book. Then there are 5 case studies chapters, which I found fun. Like, this was the best part of the book, and I think the writing was engaging, I liked the way the stories unfolded, and the analysis. I think it's always interesting to see stories, to see how people from different backgrounds struggle and how they overcome their struggles. Even though these stories had one common theme, that is childhood abuse, so it was technically tied more by childhood abuse than anything else, I'd say. And the author tries to present these stories as arguments to why addiction is not a disease. But I don't think it's that well done. I don't think it supports the idea. Because if I remember correctly, I think the author kind of shows that addiction is a life stage. It's something that disappears on its own, but that's not true. Like, the people in these stories, they went through treatment, they went to prison, they went through treatment again, they went to AA. I mean, it definitely did not go away on its own. Maybe the need to use left them once they completed a lot of treatments and they worked a lot. but I don't necessarily think that this means that their addiction was a life stage. It needed their input, and it often needed the input of other people as well to heal. One interesting detail is also the decision to include one story of a woman who was not addicted to drugs at all, which is certainly a choice for a book where, you focus on addiction. So this woman, she did not have any issues with drugs, but she struggled with an eating disorder. And the author draws parallels between the eating disorder, her relationship with food, and how it's similar to the way drug addicts see drugs. But it was a strange choice. I mean, yes, these two disorders, substance use disorder and eating disorder, can manifest in similar ways. There can be this pattern of quitting and relapsing, especially when the person who suffers from the eating disorder, when they struggle with binge eating. That's something that, no one really wants to do, right? So people who suffer from binge eating really tend to have this pattern of quitting and then losing their ability to fend off the need, and they overeat again and start this cycle just as an addict would. But that doesn't make them the same disorder, at least I don't think so. And I don't even think that it's the right way to demonstrate that addiction is not a disease. I mean, if anything, I think it shows that it is more of a disease. Eating disorders are complicated, and so is addiction, and treating these has a place in the medical field. And I don't think the last two chapters left a lot of impact on me, as I don't really remember them much. I think at some point I started getting bored and I started zoning out. It mostly felt like a summary with a couple of studies in between, and attempted to once again support the idea that addiction is not a disease. To me, it was repetitive. I learned no new information from these last two chapters. I was also more interested in the case studies. I wanted to hear more stories. I wanted to get to know more people. Instead, I was abruptly thrown into something that I wasn't really interested in at that point of the book. And structuring the book in this way just didn't make sense to me. And I should probably mention that I read about 2/3 of the book as a book, and I listened to the rest of it as an audiobook while hiking. But that shouldn't be an issue. I listen to a ton of audiobooks and I don't really zone out or anything. The narration was good. I don't think it took anything away from the book. I think the case studies are the best part of the book, and I found the rest of it a bit too wordy and repetitive. With one notable exception, and that is in one of the last two chapters. It dealt with the concept of ego fatigue. And I think that's something I would like to read about more and maybe make a video, if it makes sense. Because from what the author presented, it made sense, but I don't really know how, science-based it was, or whether it was more like pop science. So that's something that I would definitely like to explore more. But regardless of these issues, the book was very well received with 4.6 stars on Amazon and 4 stars on Goodreads. And the reviews I read on these sites were mostly positive. The main argument presented here is that addiction is not a disease but a completely normal and desirable function of the brain, and that developing addiction is biologically necessary as brains form habits, and that treatment based on the idea of addiction being a disease should be changed to something more viable. And first of all, I want to say that I respect the author, and I enjoyed reading the book. I went through his arguments, and in the framework that he presented them in, it made sense, sure. But I also think there were some areas that I just found lacking. I think maybe the author created a new category that is once again too stiff and doesn't take into account other parts of addiction etiologies, such as we now know that genetics is a huge part of addiction, something that was never mentioned in the book. What was presented felt more like a new box, something addicts need to fit in, the deep learning category. It didn't really help with the categorization problem. But addiction is complicated and it can't be simply categorized. Classification is incredibly important for several reasons. One, people love putting ideas into neat little boxes. It's completely natural to want to group concepts together to form a bigger, clearer picture. And it is also incredibly important for funding and treatment purposes. If we need to treat addiction, who will fund the treatment centers? Who has the necessary expertise to treat addicts? Is it a social issue? Is it a health issue? A public health issue? From this point of view, classification is incredibly important. And funding, for one, is something that can really make or break facilities. It is something that can really make or break how we treat addiction as a whole. And I think the author recognizes this need, and I think he understands why the disease model is important. And I understand why classification is important. But I find these boxes, these categories, too stifling, especially the one-dimensional models of addiction. And I don't necessarily think that many ideas can't coexist, and I see no problem with it being a both learned behavior and a disease classifiable by the ICD. And I'm not the only one. When I studied addictology, we talked a lot about the biopsychosocial spiritual model of addiction, which acknowledges that addiction is complex and does not stem from one root. But to be fair, maybe it's just prevalent in my bubble, this model of addiction, and it's quite possible that in other fields, some one-dimensional models are still used without acknowledging other factors, but I personally don't think it's that common anymore. Maybe in people who don't really specialize in addiction, but from people I've met, we're pretty much on board that it is a complex issue that a model with just one root cannot really cover. And the disease classification is mostly a concept that is used by humans for humans to group concepts together. It's not inherently like these groups exist in nature. Humans make these groups. We group cancer together, but cancer is not a cancer, it's cancers. Many different diseases that can be treated by someone who specializes in cancer because these diseases have something in common, but it's cancers. They're very different. Multiple sclerosis is not just multiple sclerosis, it's multiple sclerosis. It's a whole bunch of different but similar diseases that can be treated by more or less the same drugs, even though not all drugs work for all people and we don't really know why. So you can see that we just group these illnesses together to make it easier for humans to work with them, not because it's inherently just one category. And for mental health illnesses, we have other illnesses such as depression. Depression is not depression, it's depressions. You don't really know if it's, someone died and that triggered something in your brain that you couldn't let go of the grief in a time frame that would be normal. You don't know it's something that was triggered by something. And some depressions are fairly easy to treat while others are treatment resistant. And in this way, I'd argue that addiction is a bunch of different addictions that can be grouped together based on one factor, and that is that the person consumes drugs. If you're going to classify things, you will need to draw the line somewhere. And I think it's useful to recognize that there are more factors, more reasons why someone could get addicted. And I think it's important to have professionals that can deal with different types of addictions so the person could seek out the help they need and not just one box fits all help that doesn't really help everyone. Some people need to talk about their childhood trauma. Some people need to get their shit together in the present, not the past. Some people just really need to suppress the physical need. And no amount of talking about their issues helps them. They just literally, their body craves it. And these people cannot be treated the same way. And the case studies chosen in the book felt cherry-picked. If you look hard enough, you can find anecdotal evidence supporting almost anything. And even though they were cherry-picked to support the idea, I don't even think they supported the idea altogether. As I said, the addiction just didn't go away on its own. The people worked on themselves. They sought out treatment. They went to jail. They went to AA. It wasn't a miracle. One day I'll wake up and I'll just don't do heroin again. Reading the anecdotal evidence in this book was fun. I enjoyed the stories, but it ultimately felt like my grandma smoked back a day and she lived till 90. Well, good for your grandma, but we still know that cigarettes are dangerous. And I'm not even sure that many people, or at least among Czech addictologists, think that addiction is not at least partially a learned behavior. After all, this is what treatment does, or what the treatment I've seen does. It often works with the addicts to teach them new behaviors, to teach them new patterns of responding to situations, to, let's say, help them unlearn the previously learned behavior that is undesirable. And maybe the book is just a product of its time. After all, it came out in 2015, almost 10 years ago. The way we understand biology and neurobiology and addiction has changed since then. It's an ever-evolving field. But to me, the book didn't feel as groundbreaking as you would believe from the reviews you can read on Amazon or Goodreads. The author is very opinionated, but he doesn't present himself as such. But then again, this is just my opinion, so if you've read the book, let me know in the comments what you think. And lastly, let's just quickly talk about who would I recommend this book to. I think a lot of people would benefit from reading the book, and I would recommend it to professionals. I think that reading books or materials outside of what you usually think is useful. It's useful to expand your knowledge. And even if you don't agree with the premise, the more useful it can be. And reading it doesn't mean that you have to agree at the end of it. It just means that you discovered something new maybe. You know some more arguments and you can decide on your own what you believe. Would I recommend this book to people who are trying to quit? Well, maybe. I mean, case studies can be interesting and successful case studies can be motivating. It can help people feel seen, and if you can relate to one of the stories, even understood on a level that you've maybe never felt understood before. So maybe it could help someone at some point of their journey. But I also wouldn't put it on like recommended literature for people who just decided to quit or something. I think it can be dangerous in a way. There's this implication that addiction is not a disease and that your brain will heal, or unlearn addictive behavior once it's time. And in this way, it undermines professionals who are trained to help people with sobriety, and it can prevent someone from seeking out professional help, even though they would benefit from it. There are people who quit on their own, but there are also many more people who didn't. So let's not forget that. And lastly, would I recommend this book to someone who wants to know more about biology and who wants to have a deeper scientific understanding of addiction? Well, no. The biological part of the book felt lacking and disconnected. I don't currently have an alternative. If you want a deep dive into alcohol, then maybe you can read David Nutt's book about alcohol, but that mostly deals with alcohol. Still a good read though. But that's it for today's video. I hope you learned something new and interesting, and if you've read the book, let me know in the comments how you liked it. If you have any other book recommendations, I'm open to reading pretty much anything that sounds good, and it might take me a while to get to it, but I will. I'm reading Drinking Up the Revolution, How to Smash Big Alcohol and Reclaim Working Class Joy next. And it's also a book that one of you recommended to me here on YouTube a couple of months ago, and I will probably make a review, but it will take me a long time. And if you're interested in mobile games, you could try my game. It's called Mushroom Match and it's available on both Android and iOS, and I'll put the links in the video description and I'll be happy if you give it a try. So thanks for watching, see you next time, bye!